Hello and welcome. This is the Culture and Inequality After Technology panel hosted by the Culture section of the American Sociological Association. And I'm Julia Ticona. I'm an assistant professor of communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm incredibly excited to get to the panelists' papers today. We have a wonderful lineup of folks. But first, a few thank yous before I introduce our first panelist, and we'll go through in alphabetical order after that. The thank yous to the incoming chair of the culture section, Terry McDonald, for inviting me to do this panel. The outgoing chair of the culture section, also Allison Pugh, who's hosting what is sure to be an amazing panel on power, race, and technology. What is now tomorrow, Friday. Please check it out. If you're watching this video, you would probably also like that one. And also my partner, Dan, who's feeding a screaming toddler right now. So apologies to any, or not apologies, it is. That's what's happening. You might hear that in the background. Quickly about what you're going to hear, some of the papers that you're about to hear. From online labor platforms to algorithmic predictive policing, digital technologies are mediating processes that have long occupied sociologists of inequality and are also very excitingly being discussed widely throughout the ASA program this year, perhaps more than ever before. It's very exciting for me. However, these systems are often understood as being somehow outside of or influencing culture. But as I don't need to tell the folks watching this video, digital technologies and data-intensive automated systems are shot through with cultural meanings. From the creation of evaluation and rating systems to the construction of moral boundaries and identities, the meanings of lots of different stakeholders, designers, users, organizations have become critical for understanding the production of inequality after technology. These papers that you'll hear today all explore the ways that meanings are mobilized to shape hierarchies between groups based on gender, race, class, nationality, within and across different kinds of socio-technical systems. They also examine the ways that cultural meanings shape attempts to fix or remedy the inequalities that are produced in these contexts in the first place. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, our first speaker, Dr. Burcu Baykurt. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And I will be switching my screen, Burcu, when you...
Yes, I am sharing my screen. You can see it? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Julia, for leading this panel, organizing it, inviting all of us. I'm incredibly excited to hear from all the panelists. My paper today will talk about titled Enduring Inequalities in the Digital City, and it will be based on my work on smart cities in the context of the United States. Oops, yes. So for the last 5 years, I've been researching the phenomenon of smart cities and how this model of tech-driven local governance is shaping existing inequalities in urban environments. So for those of you who may be less familiar, let me quickly describe what a smart city is. It refers to places where the city's existing infrastructures are augmented with sensors, cameras, wireless tech, public Wi-Fi, digital kiosks, in order to collect continuous data about the city. And bringing tech companies into local environments is very alluring to many resource-poor municipalities these days, because most of these locales are desperate to become the next Silicon Valley, or are simply broke, and they need the kind of capital infusion coming from tech companies. So while we hear a lot about the promises of the smart city, its marketing, its sort of even critiques, we don't fully know how smartness operates on the ground and in what way it changes or challenges existing local issues. So my case study to pursue these questions is Kansas City, Missouri, where local government worked with first Google and then Cisco to test the gigabit internet service and a smart city pilot respectively over the last decade. In 2011, Google picked Kansas City as the first experimental site for its Google Fiber project, which was a gigabit internet service that at the time offered 100 times faster speed than the national average. In 2015, Cisco signed an agreement with the municipality to launch a smart city program citywide, which included sensors on sidewalks, public transportation, public Wi-Fi, kiosks. And inside the local government, there was an innovation team that tried to come up with creative solutions. Local entrepreneurs were invited to City Hall. And there was a very kind of established digital equity mandate to make sure that all these changes were happening in a way that did not in any way discriminating. And that part is really important because Kansas City, being an average sort of American city in terms of size or socioeconomic statuses, it's also a pretty divided place spatially, racially, based on class. So there were a lot of long-standing social problems that public officials wanted to attack with the sort of use of smart technologies and data analytics. And those problems were very much a product of those divides. So between 2015 and 2018, I lived in Kansas City. I conducted fieldwork, in-depth interviews with public officials, tech executives, local residents. I did a content analysis of media coverage, corporate records, and policy documents. But what I want to highlight in this presentation today is this one mechanism in the smart city that reproduces inequalities, even when it directly claims to intervene in solving them, and one that I think may be counterintuitive even for this group, critical scholars of tech and urban studies, that is connectivity infrastructures. As you can see from these images, it was very important for Kansas City to become the most connected place, the most connected city, and including the sort of, disadvantaged, marginalized neighborhoods into this project. But Kansas City is not alone in this kind of approach. Digital inclusion, if you have ever heard of this term, is an often repeated goal for tech companies, municipalities, federal and foundation grants, a goal to make sure no one in the city is deprived of digital technologies is a widely shared social objective. And in the specific case of Kansas City, becoming the most connected city also had a very historically informed, special meaning. First of all, it referred to the city's racial spatial divide that is a product of a long durée of racial segregation, disinvestment, aggressive policing that separated the city's east side from the west side. But it also reflected a more recent episode that the city experienced with Google Fiber. When Google first moved into the city, they had this sort of marketing gimmick to create some excitement about their gigabit internet service. So they came up with this plan to ask to ask neighborhoods to organize themselves at the household level. So every household was invited to go on a website, pay a symbolic $10 fee, and show their interest in Google Fiber. If enough households in a neighborhood did this, they would turn into a fiberhood. And Google said that they would be prioritizing those cities when it comes to installing this gigabit infrastructure. They had the slogan of "Let's do this for Kansas City," so it was very sort of civically oriented. And they had a website that tracked the data of the fiberhoods in real time. So, so if your neighborhood met the required number of households, it turned green. And if there wasn't enough organizing or if there wasn't enough interest, it stayed yellow. Well, as the registration period neared, as you can see from this map, the map of fiberhoods looked a lot like the city's historical dividing lines. So the green parts were on the west side, the yellow parts were on the east side. As one congressman called it, this digital redlining committed by Google became national news. And both public officials and Google executives immediately kind of diagnosed this problem as an adoption issue and an affordability issue that like neighborhoods, residents on these yellow neighborhoods did not maybe fully understand or afford these technologies. So they even like more strongly embraced digital inclusion as an ethical virtue of the project that they were trying to institute at the time. So with this background, I want to talk about two projects that came out of this digital inclusion goal. A civic coalition that was established right after this sort of backfire, and a project with the Housing Authority. And what I want to show between these two examples is the gap between two conflicting narratives of connectivity that exists in the so-called smart city. So a digital inclusion coalition in Kansas City was established in 2014 with members coming from community groups, school district, public library, and even representatives from tech companies. They meet monthly with an average roster of like 20 to 30 people. I attended most of their meetings when I was living there, and a typical meeting usually includes some presentations and small group discussions. The civic leaders like to say that their goal with this coalition is to track the success of equity-related programs in Kansas City and offer frameworks for organizations that do the actual work of training, access, community building on the ground. So rather than producing any substantive projects or policies, what this group really does is setting the public agenda and further like sustaining it in the face of criticism that connectivity is a universal virtue, a conduit to remedy digital inequity, if you will. And most of the time, this coalition's narratives echo what was coming out of Google Fiber and public officials at the time of the digital redlining episode, so that neighborhoods should be educated, they should be better connected, they need guidance, training, and etc. In 2016, while this group coalition was still meeting and working, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, under the Obama administration at the time, partnered with companies like Google Fiber, AT&T, and Verizon to provide connectivity to public housing residents in select cities, and in a program called Connect Home. And Kansas City again became one of the pilots, and Google Fiber worked with the local public housing authority to wire the complexes with the super fast internet. Google offered the super fast internet for free for a lifetime for each household, along with affordable devices, computer labs, and training programs that would ostensibly prepare the residents for the smart city economy. All residents had to do was to sign up, this time not online, and invite the technicians to come in and install the setup. I cannot provide the exact numbers because Google never officially disclosed them, but it has soon become very clear that most residents in these public housing residencies were not interested in what Google was offering. And not just at home, they were also not interested in using the computer labs, digital kiosks, or public Wi-Fi. So Digital Inclusion Coalition and local government officials brought up the adoption problem again, that residents did not understand the value of the gigabit internet and the advantages of living in a smart city. Whereas when I conducted research in these housing complexes and interviewed residents about why they were not interested, they all shared a very legitimate skepticism about these technologies that cropped up in their living environments. They were already connected in varying degrees, so there was not a problem of not understanding what this technology was doing, but they had a problem where it was coming from. They did not trust the housing authority or Google in the first place, and they were very concerned, rightly so, to what extent they would be exposed if they adopted these technologies inside their homes. And so concerns of privacy came up again and again in my interviews with them. So in a way, that is not shocking at all. Connectivity, as we know, is not a neutral, benevolent value in the smart city, and often comes with surveillance capabilities. Most critical scholars are very aware of this problem when it comes to facial recognition technologies or predictive analytics, but we tend to forget that sometimes what might seem basic connectivity, such as free public Wi-Fi or gigabit internet or digital kiosks, still capture information and expose us in various ways. And for residents who already suffer under the prying eye of governments and policing, this kind of exposure carries a further risk, while also potentially depriving them of control or autonomy over access to being online, which remains to be essential. So a shared belief that connectivity is a public virtue blinds even the well-intentioned advocates of digital inclusion to the privacy and surveillance concerns of minoritized neighborhoods, which is something that does not get the attention it deserves in smart city conversations. The second point I want to make, which is connected but maybe a little bit more controversial, is that the narrative of digital inclusion as opposed to digital divide obfuscates rather than illuminating the structural and cultural mechanisms that worsen urban inequalities in the smart city. So the original intention behind switching from divide to inclusion was to kind of expand the stakes of this issue beyond the binary of haves and have-nots, and show that digital equity also includes skills, literacy, maintenance, design. But the inclusion rhetoric does not really make enough room for the required reckoning with cities' oppressive pasts, or examining their current practices of systemic and institutional racism and discrimination that are very much intersecting with these smart technologies that we're building in the name of upgrading public infrastructures. And instead, as one of my interlocutors very nicely put it, digital inclusion intends to make advocates feel good about connectivity without making them uncomfortable about the divide at all, or without creating spaces where those divides could be confronted. So another sort of point or argument I want to make in this presentation is maybe it's time to bring back the digital divide and start from the assumption that dismissing, if not outright exploiting, class or racial inequalities is a prerequisite, not an outcome of these smart technologies. In line with the theme of this panel, I want to invite sociologists, as coming from a communication department, to investigate the processes of meaning making and beliefs, the role of existing beliefs and trust, or lack thereof, when it comes to connectivity infrastructures and building the smart city, and really kind of look at the moralized values around these issues, because even at the most basic level, these technologies continue generating inequalities on the ground. And with that, I end my presentation and look forward to the discussion and questions.
All right, thank you very much, Burcu. Thank you for that presentation. Next, I would like to invite, actually, you know what, for the people who are watching right now, I'm going to pause the recording very briefly to check in on some technical issues, and then I will restart the recording. All right, we're back. Thank you. Technical, not so difficulties, just check in. All right, next we have Lexi Gervis, PhD candidate in sociology at Rutgers University.
Great. Let me just get the screen sharing.
Please, take your time.
Settled. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? Not yet. Now.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
And no notes?
No notes.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Hello from Brooklyn, New York at around 6:30, I think, with some plants in the background. Thank you, Julia, so much for organizing this panel. And thank you to all the other panelists. I already can tell it's going to be super interesting, so thank you. Okay, my talk today is called Portable Benefits, the Bending, Breaking, and Rebuilding of the Social Safety Net. I'm just trying to fix my video, there we go. And I'm gonna dive right in. So workers today are Uber drivers, TaskRabbiters, domestic workers, and freelance consultants, and their work arrangements are really as varied as the jobs themselves. But all these workers are considered non-standard, and they exist outside of the traditional W-2 relationships between employer and employee, which leaves them without the benefits like paid sick and safe time, unemployment, retirement savings, etc., that a company would typically provide. So one proposed solution to this is portable benefits, which would be benefits that would be tied to the worker instead of their company, so that it could allow a benefit structure to follow workers wherever their work brings them, and ideally across all these different work arrangements. So this solution has seen really a flurry of activity in recent years, including policy proposals at each level of the government, but also a number of organizations, both for-profit ones and non-for-profit ones, that are designing portable benefit models aimed at different groups of non-standard workers. Drawing on interviews with and ethnographic work with the organizations designing these solutions, with advocacy workers implementing them, and the observation of government boards that are tasked with exploring them, my project examines how current models are succeeding, and in some cases not succeeding, in answering the call to provide benefits for this transient workforce. So while the idea of portable benefits seems pretty straightforward in its conception, its execution has really been anything but simple. So many of these new work arrangements rely on technological solutions to dictate their work, which renders employees subject to a virtual app-simulated boss. And when these technologies create the absence of a flesh and blood employer, who then is responsible for workers and their well-being? Who is responsible not only financially, but morally for workers and their benefits really sits at the heart of the portable benefits debate. So as I've studied the models that organizations have created and the debates around their implementation and use, I've really found a persistent thread around this idea of morality. To provide workers with benefits seems to be first and foremost a moral issue. So as a result, I draw on the markets and moral literature, specifically for Cade and Healy's conception of markets as intensely moralized and moralizing entities. And I also drew inspiration from the review piece, The Relationship of Morals and Markets Today, which Julia is a co-author on, which made clear that there are a lot of fruitful questions still to consider when it comes to markets and morality. Two that felt particularly relevant to my project were how should people act in a capitalist economy and to whom should they feel obligated? And also how have traditional moral frameworks changed in recent years as a result of structural economic shifts? So as I said, there's been this persistent emphasis on morality in the portable benefit models that I've been studying. In the larger paper, I make the case that this can be traced back to the origins of our social insurance programs in the US, which were largely the product of women's activism in the early 1900s that emphasized, as Theda Skocpol puts it, extending the moral values and social caring of the home into the larger community. But for the purpose of today and a short presentation, I'll simply say that there has been a clear effort on the part of organizations designing portable benefit models to embed moral values in the actual design of their models. And in the case of both for-profit and nonprofit contexts, the structure of the model and the nature of their revenue streams becomes crucial to understand, as I think it provides a window into what extent they are able to successfully embed these values in their designs. So specifically, I witnessed 4 types of mechanisms employed by organizations in the service of maintaining morality, which I'm calling communal enrichment, reclaiming technology, redistribution, and revenue safeguards. So as you might have guessed, for today's theme for the panel, I'll be focusing on one mechanism, reclaiming technology, for my talk, and unpacking the ways in which model designers are building moral values into the technology that will sustain their portable benefit systems. So first, it's important to know that in a typical W-2 employment arrangement where benefits are actually housed within a company, so non-portable benefits, the employee is connected to the benefit, obviously via the employer. And the employer serves as the intermediary, and the HR department is typically the data center. But in the case of non-standard workers, this intermediary doesn't exist. Workers exist across industries, employers, and types of work arrangements. And as a result, some kind of centralizing force will be needed. And many within the portable benefits field believe that it will be digital technology in particular that will play that role. So as this quote says, all of the future portable benefit models share a common reliance on developing a technology platform that mediates the relationship between customer, in this case, non-traditional workers, funder, which might be the worker, the employer, et cetera, and the benefits administrator, which would be the insurance company. In other words, technology will need to be both the mediator and the aggregator, providing a way to unify non-standard workers both within an industry across different employers. So domestic workers, for example, would be one industry, or rideshare drivers would be another, as well as industries themselves. So freelance accountants or freelance web developers. And I think this has the potential to give undue power to technology that will act as the key arbiter, especially given the lack of a central employer who might otherwise typically wield that power, for better or for worse. But to counteract this kind of undue power that could be given to technology, there are two models that I've studied, Opalis and Alia, that saw an opportunity to embed moral values within the technological systems that will do the centralizing of workers on their platforms, which will provide a pathway to maintain moral commitments to the workers they serve. And I'm going to discuss each in turn. So starting with Opalis. In the spring of 2020, Opalis launched the Employment Commons, which is a worker-owned cooperative that aims to band together a broad spectrum of non-standard workers within a framework that provides all of the advantages of a typical employment structure, but without the kind of overarching employing corporation. And the Employment Commons is designed to give workers access to employment opportunities, financial automation services, and most importantly, for my purposes, a really robust range of portable benefits. Opalis's chief steward, which is the language used in cooperatives, John Paller, explained to me in an interview that the selection of the cooperative structure itself was morally driven. It was intended to create what he called structural benevolence, in that if the model is owned by workers, these workers can't be exploited. Importantly, though, Paller also thought it crucial that the technological structure itself was benevolent. In fact, he actually used the term technological benevolence. And he told me that technology has a very important role to play in the future of these things, in building ecosystems that are truly egalitarian, sustainably benevolent, and scalable, so that they empower human beings, not just create value extraction farms for shareholders. And here, the value extraction farms for shareholders that he's referring to signifies corporations and how they typically profit from users and their data. So to kind of guard against this and imbue Opalis with technological equity, Paller had waded into the realm of blockchain technology, which he very patiently explained to me, the neophyte. And he told me that blockchains are immutable databases. They are publicly driven, they're open source. Essentially, anyone can participate in a blockchain network, and the data, once mined to a block, becomes immutable. You can't change it because of the way that the data is being validated, it's distributed. And here's the crux. So blockchain technology as an engine for creating sustainably benevolent technological ecosystems is really what people are pushing on in the blockchain space. But benevolence is really key here. So essentially, the Opalis Employment Commons is going to run on an open source blockchain technology driven network. And what's really important about this is that it means it's going to be able to achieve a kind of seeming paradox, which is the aggregation of non-standard workers on a network that will still really remain disaggregated or decentralized. And the moral implications of this are significant. So individuals will be able to achieve the advantage of group aggregation, which is super necessary when trying to secure benefits. while still remaining essentially independent, which prevents them from losing control of their own data and becoming part of the extraction farms that Paller lamented. And this decentralized while still remaining central structure, in his hope, would obviate the need for temporary staffing businesses, which are often kind of the default structure that might function in this role for non-standard workers. And even this is moral in itself, because Paller and others saw these staffing businesses as highly exploitative, and freeing non-standard workers from their clutches would be, to use his words, benevolent. So in this way, the model is able to reclaim technology that might otherwise be used to exploit workers and instead use it to empower them. So turning now to ALIA. The model from the National Domestic Workers Alliance, or NDWA, ALIA, is a web-based platform that creates an online bank of employers' contributions, which cleaners could use to cash in for paid time off in the form of a gift card, and they can also purchase accident insurance and life insurance. And all of these transactions, workers signing up, employees paying in, workers managing their account, take place online through ALIA's website. But there is a bit of a contradiction in ALIA's use of a technical solution for an industry whose workers might not be as technologically fluent as those in other industries. And in its initial stages of implementation, ALIA's technology did prove challenging for workers to navigate, as there were issues with language access, email signups, and navigating the online platform. However, Palak Shah, the founding director of NDWA Labs, which is the offshoot of NDWA that was responsible for designing ALIA, made clear that the focus on a technological solution is intentional and actually, in their view, essential. It's an attempt to reclaim technology from the grasps of a technological intervention that is already exploiting domestic workers. In a speech she gave at a MoMA WorksFairs event in May of 2019, she spoke about the entrance of Silicon Valley companies, the Uber of cleaning, the Uber of care, that are entering and disrupting and digitizing what has been an invisible and informal market. And what she sees as the opportunity in that, when there is a centralizing mechanism, is that you can actually set the norms. But the question fundamentally is who gets to control that coming together and the aggregation and the actual code on the platform. It gets to a deeper philosophical question about whether or not labor markets, for example, should be owned by a private entity, and whether or not we should reconceptualize in society access to the labor market as fundamentally a public good. So similarly to Paller, Shah sees technology in its current forms as enabling the ownership of workers. In the case of domestic workers, this is by formalizing and centralizing a labor market that was previously informal and disaggregated. However, while Opalis is hoping to rely on a decentralized structure to preempt this kind of exploitation, NDWA sees centralization as an opportunity to reclaim the technology in a kind of beat them at their own game mentality. So instead of avoiding technological consolidation, Shah argues that we must consider in the context of what we believe is the moral good, i.e. what she said before, access to the labor market as fundamentally a public good. So in other words, centralization can be good if it is controlled by those who are looking to uplift workers and not exploit them. And importantly, reclaiming technology in this case is not just about centralizing workers, but it actually provides a way to centralize the movement itself. In an interview with Shah, she explained to me that she sees the digital infrastructure that they built as a connective tissue and scaffolding for the whole domestic workers movement, far outside of just enabling the provision of benefits. She also said that she's very much convinced that digital infrastructure is going to be a major enabler of creating change in this sector. So starting with a benefit structure, even if it might prove challenging for domestic workers in its initial phases, she hopes will provide the foundational technology to power the entire movement that NDWA is building. So I want to close quickly. I think I'm almost out of time, but I want to touch briefly on the wider implications of this. Because embedding moral values in technology does not need to be limited to the provision of benefits for non-standard workers or the case of portable benefits specifically. This article from July from the Aspen Institute details the ways in which technology is currently being used to improve the safety net. And they write that in recent years, a growing number of organizations bearing some of the characteristics of the modern tech industry have arisen and applied design skills, data science, agile development methods, user research, and ultra-modern technology in service of supporting access to the safety net. I think that this could be the next frontier of moral-centered design when it comes to our safety net, and I think it sounds very promising. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Lexi. And next, we will be having Leslie K. Jones.
So, Julia, I've actually created a title page because it occurred to me that people might be looking for such a thing.
Awesome.
And it does have a couple pictures attached to it, so I thought that might be kind of useful. So I'm just going to go ahead and
share your screen. I also want to mention that Dr. Jones is assistant professor of sociology at Rutgers University before she shares her slides.
Okay. Let me do it and then do it like this. There it goes. Okay.
I can see it.
Yeah.
All right, Leslie, whenever you're ready.
All right, I guess I'll go ahead and get started then. Wow, so I'm really glad that I'm having the opportunity to gather with this particular group. I have already, my brain is already like firing in a million different directions based on Burcu's presentation and Lexi's presentation. So I'm looking forward to like drawing some connections there. So the reason why I had the hold up for the title page is because I've been, I don't know, for some reason, extremely resistant to PowerPoints. And I think that it has to do with the fact that I know that we're going to be trapped in a sort of pseudo like PowerPoint hell dimension for like the foreseeable future as teaching. So maybe I didn't want to do it because of that. But there's also something about telling this story that makes people ask me for lots of pictures. People want screenshots. So when I say I'm going to be talking about Black women in cyberspace, specifically on Twitter, which is where the bulk of my field work is, and people, they want to see sort of like evidence of like this huge abuse problem, and that's sort of manifests as wanting to see like almost like a slate of people being abused is what that would look like. So in lieu of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a visual aid of some of the abuse that I received when I first started, when I first embarked on this project as a graduate student. I do not even remember, it's been so long. You see this 2016. So I don't even remember what it was that I had tweeted. It was something completely banal. But the person responded, "Soon to be strange fruit," and with the reference to the song, that haunting song about lynching by Billie Holiday, "Strange Fruit." And I remember thinking to myself, I'm from Florida, so I remember thinking to myself, like, you know, people say stuff like this to me every single day. Like people, I grew up, like there are places, you know, where I'm from where if you drove in the wrong direction, you would end up in a place and you would just know you better turn around and get out of there really, really quick. So on the one hand, when I first took this screenshot, I really wasn't so fazed by it. It really wasn't a huge part of the story for me. And I guess I want to draw attention to how my project is now pivoting to the study of disinformation. And yet, in its pivot to disinformation, it's coming right back to this account here, and accounts just like it, this soon to be strange fruit, an account which, as far as I can tell, doesn't even exist anymore on Twitter, or maybe it's suspended and therefore can't be found, you know, because of similar behavior. But it's really part of a platform problem that has become a media ecosystem problem, which is that some huge critical mass of the accounts on Twitter literally only exist to be so abusive that they derail the genuine conversations that people are trying to have on the platform. That is the only reason that they exist. I know that there are people who have experienced like real life consequences of people threatening them in this way, like these types of death threats, especially, you know, some of them have been professors of mine who have a large platform on Twitter, and it gets to the point where they have to delist all of their information with the university because the phone calls, the threats, the students helping to surveil them for so-called independent journalistic publications who exist to harass so-called leftist professors. Those entities are all, that is exactly what Twitter is. That's how Twitter is making its money. And so I guess the presentation that I really wanted to do today, in lieu of doing like a very like traditional, this is what I know, is to, now that I have, you know, people in the room who actually think about this for a living, is to actually think through how we might approach a problem that is a problem of anonymity and scale and disinformation, that is, as much as I call to account, you know, Jack Dorsey and Twitter as a platform for, you know, for ignoring Black women on the platform when they're getting these types of threats, which are sort of like, these are regular, daily, perpetual occurrence on Twitter. It is also a problem of what is the conversation other than that? Because we're sociologists, we're studying these conversations, we're studying hashtags, and we're reporting to people that the stories that are emerging from these hashtags, that the narratives that are emerging from these hashtags reflect grassroots organization. They do reflect grassroots organization, but a lot of that grassroots organization is precisely disinformation, and we're kind of just sort of ignoring it because the people who are primarily the victims and the targets are not the right types of victims. So here's an example of what it looks like when we think about this from the perspective of a disinformation problem and not an abuse problem. This is an account that is supposed to be representing the Emmett Till Center. And I would just like to draw anybody who's viewing their attention to the spelling of the Twitter handle. And if you look at the spelling of the Twitter handle, you can see very clearly that they've spelled the name of Emmett Till incorrectly. And that's certainly not something that a legitimate organization, or even an organization that was legitimately, or a person who was invested in the memory of this victim, would have, you know, front and center as their naming. So we can already be suspicious of this account. But as you can see, the screenshot was taken today. This is a screenshot from today, Thursday, August 6th, and it has 22,000 followers. And a lot of those thousands of followers are actually educators. They are, I mean, I would encourage people to look now. I think that, I mean, some of the people I know follow it. And it's gotten to the point where there's almost no point in informing people of these individual accounts, because there are so many of these accounts that people, first of all, they get frustrated with being deeply suspicious. It's like a deeply alienating experience to get on Twitter every day, I can say, and be followed by people who you know are surveilling you. Because when you open up their accounts, you see telltale signs like the fact that they're only following Black women, or they're only following like Black academics, and they're retweeting all of their tweets, but they are not interacting or engaging in any other way. And I don't like to list all of the different ways that we counter surveil and know these accounts aren't real. Instead, I like to draw attention to accounts that have done this very, very successfully. They've done this so successfully that they've gotten the platform of thousands of people. And then what can happen is, this account can go on to influence not only hashtag protests, but our archive and our historical record of what a hashtag protest is trying to accomplish. And so are we calling that a disinformation problem? Are we calling this a problem of targeted abuse? Are we calling this a problem? I mean, Jesse Daniels called for us to investigate cloaked websites. What is it now? Almost 15 years ago, something like that. I don't know, if I keep on forgetting that I'm not talking to anyone. Like I'm asking people to answer questions, but there's nobody. Yeah. Normally there would be like an audience member, and somebody would be like, "Oh yeah, I read that book," and then you would just like give the response.
Yeah, you are right. I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Got it.
All right. So this cloaked website problem has only grown or metastasized into a social media problem that exists multi-platform: Facebook, Reddit, TikTok. At one point in time, do we call this a culture problem? And that's why I keep on bringing it up in culture, because everybody wants to focus on the tech part of like, well, okay, how do you know that this is a sock puppet? And in many ways, the question of how do I know that this is a fake account is much less useful than what it means that an account can acquire 22,000 followers and the platform that accompanies that, and nobody will ask any questions, and how that rolls over every single day into issues like the account that's been revealed now from Arizona State University, sciencing _ an entire fake professor that was created again to influence the discourse and grassroots organizing that was happening among Indigenous people on Twitter. So people have a sophisticated understanding that organization takes place, discursive organization takes place on Twitter, and they leverage the abuse of particular populations, specifically those hyper-visible populations, the ones that seem to always be getting the stories covered because, oh, you've got like a hashtag of, I know one that was recently was Black in the Ivory. That was a hashtag that was started by a graduate student. I don't remember her last name, Joy. I don't remember her last name, but in any case, this Black in the Ivory hashtag, those types of hashtags are extremely vulnerable to being hijacked, precisely because anybody can get on and participate in it, and then the people who are reporting it, from journalists to sociologists, produce a narrative that this is a cohesive protest in and of itself, and we erase that culture. We erase that cultural reality. The people who are on Twitter who are having the discussion have a very sophisticated understanding of, for example, the politics of who came up with the hashtag in the first place. You know, there are most of the accounts that I did my ethnography with, when I was looking for Black cyber feminists who had influence in the Black Twitter counterpublic, we're looking at people who started in about 2008 to use their Twitter account in that way. And so people have relationships with one another, and there's an extent to which, you know, somebody might be skeptical if a certain person produces a hashtag, and that might influence whether or not a hashtag actually picks up steam or not. But on our ends, when we're just sort of, especially not ethnographically, but like sort of retrospectively scraping or doing content analysis on tweets, we are also acting on the culture. We're acting on the artifacts that get produced, that ultimately become the only basis that most people have of accessing the meanings of these protests. So I just really want to put on people's radar the importance of understanding disinformation on Twitter as a culture problem, because thus far it's really been treated as sort of like a, you know, people don't like Twitter, get off Twitter. But it's more than just people being abused. It's about how the story that emerges about who is using Twitter and what people are using Twitter for occludes major destructive cultural forces that are acting on our entire media ecosystem. And it's kind of unfortunate, because I would argue that Twitter is almost where they're probably most visible to us social scientists if we were to bother looking. How am I on time? I feel weird asking that, but I have no idea.
You are at 14 and change, so you've got a little bit of time to wrap up.
That is me wrapping up.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Perfect timing then. 14 and change. All right, let me change the speaker. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Wow.
Thank you, Julia.
I want to talk all about the methodological implications of what you just said. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Thank you so much, Leslie. And now I would like to invite Dr. Dan Kotliar, currently a visiting scholar in the Stanford Department of Communication and an incoming assistant professor of sociology at the University of Haifa.
Thank you, Julia, for organizing this panel, and to all of you for these fascinating talks. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and the speaker view looks okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll stop. Okay, so our lives are quickly becoming algorithmic. Algorithms extract our data, categorize us, profile us, and have deep and often tangible effects on our lives. Our choices, our identities, our life chances are increasingly affected by the algorithmic gaze. We're perpetually seen by this gaze and are deeply influenced by it. But who's we? Well, recent research has shown that algorithms stem from specific sociocultural contexts, and the data tends to mirror the social surroundings from which it was extracted. The geographical and cultural distances between those who develop profiling algorithms and those who are being profiled remains somewhat overlooked. Moreover, while recent research tends to compare algorithmic power with colonial powers, the move from the colonial gaze to the algorithmic gaze has yet to be fully discussed. So, what happens when the geographic, epistemic, and cultural distances between those who surveil and those who are being surveilled are exceptionally wide? How do tech companies deal with such distances, with such cultural differences, and how do they get their algorithms to see their other? Thanks to Said, Spivak, and other post-colonial thinkers, we now know what it means when painters use their brush to depict the other, when novelists write books about the other, and when scholars study the other. But what does it mean when tech companies use their algorithms to see and profile their other? What happens to this knowledge power nexus when this knowledge is algorithmically created? In this talk, I'll briefly explore how Israeli companies use their algorithms to categorize non-Western users and to overlook locality by what I term coding against culture. I'll also describe how, unlike their algorithms, these companies pave their way into East Asia using much more traditional views on culture with what I call data orientalism. I'll eventually argue that, in fact, Israeli companies try to escape their own otherness by joining those who see. This paper is based on a 5-year ethnographic study of the Israeli data analytics scene. And for the sake of brevity today, I'll focus on one such company, which I call Extractive. Extractive is an Israeli startup company that provides user profiling algorithms to telecommunication companies in East Asia, mainly in China, Singapore, and the Philippines. Based on multiple data sources, Extractive generates user analytics that allegedly help their clients form a better understanding of their customers. I asked Dalia, Extractive's VP, how they generate user analytics if they're not familiar with the language or culture of the users they profile. She answered, quote, "Our algorithms allow us to understand people in a language agnostic way. We can understand Chinese speakers, Russian speakers, and practically any other speaker. Psychologists would have needed to speak their language in order to understand them and use psychological tools to conceptualize them. For them, language is a crucial tool, but for us, with our algorithms, we use only one tool to understand many languages. The system knows how to automatically understand people with no relation to their language or culture." End quote. Extractive's algorithms are primarily based on Facebook data and specifically on user metadata. That allows them to focus on users' online actions rather than on their seemingly more stable characteristics such as their ethnicity, nationality, race, or culture. And this is what I call coding against culture, the creation and use of algorithms that presumably generate knowledge about people while overlooking their national, lingual, or cultural characteristics. It's a universalizing gaze that promises to transcend lingual and cultural boundaries and to quickly expand into new territories. But it's also one that goes beyond previous universalizing epistemologies. After all, Dalia here just mocked psychology for its dependence on language-based methodologies and insinuated that with her language agnostic algorithms, she can get much further than psychology and reach a much more specific and much more accurate understanding of people. This, of course, echoes the description of algorithmic identities as post-demographic, post-hegemonic, micro-individuated, or flexible identities. But in this case, it serves as a means to scale beyond your own cultural, geographical boundaries. And so, while language-agnostic algorithms may overlook cultural differences, they do so only to point at other, allegedly more fine-grained differences. After all, difference is the bedrock of the data analytics industry. Knowing users, producing analytics about them, necessarily entails differentiating between them. And so these algorithms offer a universalizing perspective, no doubt, but one that favors interpersonal differences over intercultural ones. But algorithms, as we all know, are sociocultural creations. And so in order to understand them, one is to examine the socio-technical assemblage that surrounds them, the people who write them, sell them, buy them, use them, with their own specific perceptions, worldviews, and narratives. In this case, examining the ways in which Extractive's employees see their so-called other partners and other users would better contextualize this algorithmic gaze. I asked Dalia about their work in the East. Here's what she told me, quote, "The business culture there is totally unpretentious. They're open to new things, and they're essentially leapfrogging now. But until recently, they had nothing. While Europe and the US have evolved very gradually, they have these huge gaps. They totally lack local expertise. They don't have universities, no technological institutions, nothing. But they do have a lot of money because they have lots of customers." So while extractive algorithms supposedly overlook culture, this quote demonstrates that culture does play a significant role in how Dalia and her company see their Eastern partners. In this sweeping Orientalist generalization, Dalia describes the Asian economies in which they operate, and essentially Asia as a whole, as outdated and backward. For her, the Asian others may be rich and hence offer funding for her startup, but their wealth is explained by the size of Asian populations, not by their technological or entrepreneurial merits. That's an embarrassingly blunt example of techno-Orientalism, one that demonstrates an overwhelmingly essentializing view of the other, but at the same time imagines a collusive, futurized Asia, one you can work with. That is, while extractive's algorithmic gaze could potentially offer a post-hegemonic, post-structural, and perhaps even a post-colonial way of seeing, Dalia sees the world through the old colonial lens, through a language of essentialist distinctions that paradoxically depict giant corporations from the East as weak subalterns. And indeed, this Orientalist remark is more than an expression of Dalia's personal worldview. It's part of Extractive's business plan. It's another strategy through which they try to expand the reach of their algorithmic gaze eastwards. As Doron, Extractive's chief data scientist, described in another interview, quote, "Around there, the problem of privacy doesn't exist. There's just no such thing, nada. And people there are also very open to spam, but they don't call it that. They call it fun. They also love deals and they love notifications. People actually want it. You know, if you or I started living on coupons like they do there, then maybe we could have saved some money, but we wouldn't bother, would we? But they have this psychological, cultural background. It's just, that's the kind of people that they are, uncomplicated. They use social media all the time, and telcos are everything for them. Telcos are their fathers and mothers, it's the establishment. They have communities that have no one to trust but their telcos." End quote. In Doron's eyes, the East is seen as the solution to what is for such companies the problem of privacy. And this solution lies in cultural difference, in the perceived attributes of these imagined Asian others. Doron contrasts the uncomplicated, gullible behavior of his others with his own behavior, and explains that these so-called differences are hardwired. They stem from their psychology and culture. At the same time, these alleged differences serve to justify the vast data collection that is at the base of this company. It is once again an extremely differentiating view of the other, an extremely essentializing view of culture. And in fact, it's the age-old Orientalist gaze, a gaze that sees this Asian culture as an excellent basis for what companies like Extractive do, extracting, analyzing, and selling user data. Like Dalia, Doron fails to recognize the discrepancy between his essentializing gaze and the culture-agnostic gaze of his algorithms, which, as we've seen, favor interpersonal differences over intercultural ones. So paradoxically, alongside the culture-agnostic gaze, otherness and cultural difference are seen as crucial resources that can help this small Israeli company expand into East Asian markets. So to sum up, Extractive's algorithmic gaze can allegedly overlook culture and automatically produce knowledge about users from any lingual, national, or cultural background. It is a gaze that supposedly transcends distances, that washes away cultural differences, and that perhaps offers a way of seeing through the otherness of the other. However, as we've just seen in their attempt to get their algorithms into East Asia, extractive in fact relies on Asia's perceived otherness. Accordingly, they see cultural difference as an appealing, almost crucial resource by which the company could get what contemporary startups need the most, user data. And that's what I call data orientalism, a way of discursively devaluing the other in order to make them seem exploitable and their data extractable. But we should keep in mind the specific geographies at play here, as well as the specific power relations, because after all, these algorithms stem from a small startup that sits in the Orient and that works for and is dependent on some very big and powerful Asian partners. So while their discourse may mirror their business aspirations, it does not provide an accurate depiction of the powers at play here. In fact, in describing their East Asian partners as exploitable and technologically backward, this company is creating its own imaginary cartography of the internet as a territory that is divided between data collectors and data subalterns, those who see and those who are being seen, but technologically and discursively placing themselves on the right side of that map. And so while this company attempts to algorithmically conceptualize the other, they in fact try to escape their own otherness by joining those who see. It's the way of imaginatively transcending the distance between their offices in Jerusalem and the Jerusalem of the heart of every Israeli technologist, Silicon Valley. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. And thank you to Dr. Jones's dog. All right. Last but absolutely not least of our panelists today is Dr. Sarah Mosseri, who is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the business school at the University of Sydney and is joining us from very far away.
Great, thank you. All right. All right, so thank you so much for that introduction, Julia, and also for putting together such a fantastic panel. I'm really delighted to be a part of it. So I'm going to be presenting my paper that's titled Being Watched and Being Seen, Negotiating Visibility in the New York City Ride-Hail Circuit. And so we're now in a period in which there is an increasing sense of surveillance at work. With new technological advancements, union decline, and a pro-business kind of regulatory framework, businesses' ability to monitor workers has expanded and intensified. And this current project focuses on one area of the work landscape where this heightened sense of worker visibility has come to fruition. And that's on digital ride-hail platforms, such as those run by companies like Uber and Lyft. As Alex Rosenblatt and others have shown, ride-hail workers are rendered highly visible at work through mechanisms like GPS tracking and consumer ratings. Now, surveillance is associated with one way of thinking about visibility at work, and that's as a condition of being watched. But being visible at work can also be about being seen. And these two experiences are guided by different visibility regimes. And I'm going to go back and forth a little bit across the slide. So sorry for the whiplash. But on the one hand is panopticism. And this is going to be familiar to most of you, but it's where surveillance or the perception of surveillance serves as a mechanism of discipline and control. On the other is what has been called the threat of invisibility regime, which reflects the fact that what is not visible is not valued or rewarded. And each of these two regimes are characterized by inequities. People of color are frequent targets of surveillance, for example, whereas women are likely to be the ones to have their work rendered invisible. These regimes are also becoming more pronounced by technological changes, and they are also shifting with the changing work landscape. So in terms of surveillance dynamics, the expansion of service work and outsourcing practices means that surveillance is no longer just about workers and managers, but can also involve consumers, third-party vendors, and other actors. Some of whom can even serve as a resource in workers' efforts to resist surveillance. And then lastly, on the bottom right, the threat of invisibility regime has been intensified within an era of precarious work, where job candidates and workers are told that they need to put themselves out there to be seen and heard in order to further their job prospects and their careers. And so as a result, people feel compelled to put in a lot of effort to become and stay relevant to specific audiences. And scholars have dubbed this largely unpaid effort as visibility labor. So considering that there are these kind of different dynamics of visibility at play, I ask in this paper how ride-hail workers who are highly visible make sense of and navigate their own experiences of visibility at work. This study is part of a larger ethnographic project, but the data that I'm presenting here today is from 9 months of ethnographic observations in 2017 and 2018, and just 18 in-depth interviews with people working in what I call the New York City ride-hail circuit. And I call it that because, as you can see here, I've tried to map it out on the right-hand side. In New York City, the stakeholders involved in ride-hail work include not only platform companies, drivers, and riders, but also regulators and labor groups. And so just to give a little bit more context about the New York City area and ride-hail work there, because it is, I would say it's unique in probably 3 main ways to other areas where ride-hail work is conducted. So first, most of the drivers in New York City are professional drivers. So they work at least 30 hours a week and claim ride-hail work as their primary source of income. They are also demographically distinct. So 97% of New York City drivers are men, 91% are born abroad, and a majority are people of color. And for comparison, I've listed some basic information about the demographics of my interview sample here, although we can come back to that in the Q&A if you'd like. A second way that New York is a bit distinct is that it's highly regulated. So the Taxi and Limousine Commission, or the TLC, requires drivers to be licensed and registered with them, which is quite costly. They have to attain commercial insurance. They have to go through mandatory trainings and regular vehicle inspections, which is a little bit more heightened than in other areas. And then third, at the time of my fieldwork, New York City was one of the few areas where drivers were starting to successfully organize. So in particular, the Independent Drivers Guild, or the IDG, represented about 50,000 New York City ride-hail drivers at the time of my study. And they've actually been a key player in bringing about some pretty meaningful reforms, particularly at the local level. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about what I found through my fieldwork. So drivers I spoke with were highly aware of being monitored by platform companies, and they regularly referred to various metrics like their ratings, ride acceptance rates, and their driving style indicators when we were talking. And I referred to this kind of bundle of metrics that was collected on them as their driving record, in part because it represents a collation of recorded information about them, but also to kind of bring attention to the ways in which this information, similar to, for example, a criminal record, can mark them with stigma and negatively influence their employment options. In general, their visibility as embodied in their record materialized in a largely quantitative form, so as a number or numbers, and these numbers carried meaning. So for example, a low rating or a high cancellation rate suggested that a driver was inadequate or doing something wrong. And drivers really felt this, and at times they echoed those sentiments in their conversations with me and with each other. However, they also contested meanings that were associated with those numbers. For example, noting how drivers who were immigrants tended to get lower ratings from riders, Fahad, who was himself born abroad, pushed back on the meanings he saw as embedded within those low ratings. So he says, it's not wrong we are immigrants. It's not wrong we don't speak perfect English. It's not wrong we don't know the system. It's not that we don't have brains, or it's not that we don't work hard. So what we can see here in Fahad's quote is some contestation over the meanings of numbers that are associated with drivers. So essentially, drivers' quantified visibility served as this kind of cultural battleground where different meanings of identity and worth were debated. Now, despite this contested nature of their record, drivers did remain accountable to it, largely because it was tied to their continued eligibility for platform work. So as Diego's quote at the bottom highlights, drivers worried a lot about their metrics, especially rider ratings, and they engaged in sometimes extensive emotional and aesthetic labor in their interactions in an effort to maintain a high ratings average. But importantly here, they also constantly monitored their record checking for errors, and addressing any inconsistencies with platform company representatives, which, given the problems with the communication channels that the platform companies have set up or had set up at the time, that could be a process that would take hours, days, or even weeks. And so I categorize this time-consuming work of managing their record as a form of visibility labor, although it's a specific form that I call reputation auditing. Through my observations and interviews, I also observed drivers working to reclaim their visibility in 3 ways. And I'm going to talk about 2 of those ways here, and then a third on the next slide. So first, drivers sought to neutralize degrading attacks on their work performance, and they did this by juxtaposing different metrics within their record. So again, I'll return to my conversation with Diego. So we were sitting in his parked car chatting, and he brought up a negative rider comment about poor driving that he had received through the app earlier that day. So he pulled out his phone and he started showing me his driving metrics, and he said, for that person to put safety, the platform companies would know. And at this point, he started scrolling through the information captured through the app and said, look, my driving style, braking, perfect. Acceleration, perfect. Speed, perfect. So for him, the matter was settled. He knew his driving performance was good, and he had the data to prove it. A second way drivers sought to reclaim their visibility was by expanding the field of vision in order to provide greater context and information captured about them. So for example, they bought dash cams to try to capture behaviors of other people that they encountered through their work, like riders, TLC agents, and famously Travis Kalanick. So Angel, who's quoted here, described the strategy to me when I asked her why she had purchased a dash cam for her car. And she told me about a traffic accident she'd been in the year before, in which she said that she was inappropriately faulted. So she said, I don't want to sound like one of those people that says it's because the cop is white and, you know, he's racist. But it was one of those situations. The guy that hit me was a white guy, and the cop was just talking to him. He ignored me. So Angel got the camera after that because she believed that in encounters like this, it was important for the full story to be visible, as opposed to only the information that was made visible about her by others. And this is, of course, as you might be thinking, an example of kind of surveillance or reverse surveillance. But what I think is important here is how this turning of the camera was done with the intention of adding context to drivers' already existing visibility. During my conversations with drivers, they frequently detailed a number of hardships, such as the inability to pay rent, health conditions caused by sitting behind the wheel for long periods, and a lack of access to basic necessities like bathrooms while they were working. And so in a third strategy of reclaiming their visibility, they repeated these grievances in front of public audiences, in the media, on online forums, and in other public venues, forcing others to kind of bear witness to their suffering. So one example of this can be seen at a public taxi and limousine commission meeting that I attended, which you can see in this image that I pulled from the TLC's website. The drivers showed up, as they did at most of the TLC meetings I attended, as a collective. And what you might not be able to see in this image is that most drivers in the audience, as well as the driver that's speaking, were wearing Independent Drivers Guild t-shirts in either black or gray. And this really made their presence noticeable. And then they got up one by one and testified about the low quality of their jobs, as exemplified in this excerpt. So I work per day, almost 10 hours, sometimes 6 days. We have almost $1,100 in expenses, but just we have from Uber company in 10 hours and 7 days, like $1,200 to $1,300 per week that we can get. So we have $200 to $300 for ourselves. So by making their suffering visible, drivers took over the public writing of their public story. They demanded that others recognize their humanity, and they advocated for dignity in their work. And I should note that their testimonies were influential, and they helped prompt and inform TLC legislation that was passed in late 2018 that mandated a minimum wage for New York City ride-hail drivers. So how can we make sense of these findings? I think first, if we compare my findings, and these are kind of preliminary thoughts, but if we compare my findings from those from research on other digital platforms, I think we can start to see how distinct visibility regimes govern different platforms, producing different experiences for workers. So I'd argue that the ride-hail platforms where my participants worked were governed more by the panopticism regime, while others, such as the social media platforms that Brooke Aaron Duffy has studied and the care work platforms that Julia, for example, has studied, are organized more around the threat of invisibility regime. And notably, I observed experiences of quantified visibility among ride-hail drivers, whereas what I might call a more personified visibility, developed through worker-generated images and narratives, emerges more prominently on some of those other platforms. And I suggest that quantified and personified visibility may also prompt different types of visibility labor. So the reputation auditing I observed among my participants is more reactive in nature, reflecting the fact that visibility is already implied and is generated primarily by others. In contrast, where the threat of invisibility regime is more pronounced, visibility is not guaranteed and is often actively sought after by workers. So visibility labor that emerges on those platforms is more proactive in nature, focused mainly on developing a profile and attracting attention. I should be clear here, I don't really see these as mutually exclusive. I think they can occur on the same platform. It's just that one may be more prominent on a particular platform based on the regime that dominates there. Just a final point in terms of comparing platforms is that it appears as though the algorithmic designs of different platforms, as we know, reflect and reproduce racialized and gendered experiences of visibility. So we see in my study the coding of surveillance into an area of digital work where men of color predominate. And through other studies, we see the coding of invisibility within feminized digital workspaces. And then lastly, it is noteworthy that drivers focus less on trying to ensure their privacy than on gaining control over the meanings of their visibility. In particular, they sought to contextualize and clarify, to kind of caption, if you will, the image of themselves that was created by others. And in doing so, they shifted, at least partially, their experiences of visibility from that of being watched to being seen, suggesting that there is some room for agency within a given regime. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you for talking about the study. These findings are fantastic. All right, with that, we are going to transition to our wonderful, generous discussant, Dr. Cassidy Puckett, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Emory University.
Thank you, Julia. So I'm first going to speak in very broad terms about these wonderful papers and all of the really interesting details. I wish all of you could read each other's. I hope that all of you read each other's work. And what I'm going to talk about, first is sort of the things that I see, the threads that I see where they come together, and the themes that they bring up. And I'm going to do this briefly, and then I'm going to pose 3 sort of overall questions for all of you to consider, and then a few specific questions for each of the papers. So my overall comments. Overall, the 5 papers take on what I would call a negotiation perspective on technology use. That is, technology is not neutral, but it is a part of a broader process of socio-political, socio-cultural negotiation, where pre-existing inequities can shape and be shaped by technologies. And such a way of considering technologies allows for investigation of how people negotiate the meaning of and use technologies within pre-existing social stratification, long embedded in the structures and practices of major social institutions. So in my own work, I look at education, I look at the relationship between technological change and inequality in healthcare, and in more recently, but for a long time, in education, right? And how this is all embedded and how this is negotiated in social institutions. And in particular, I'm interested in culture, how culture works and how organizations play a role, which I saw as a theme in all of your work. This viewpoint, this negotiation viewpoint, takes seriously the argument of science and technology scholar Langdon Winner from 1980. So we've been talking about these kinds of issues even well before that, right? But his very well, often cited 1980 article, "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And so I'm gonna quote him here because I love this quote. "The things we call technologies are the ways of building order in our world. Consciously or not, deliberately or inadvertently, societies choose structures for technologies that influence how people are going to work, communicate, travel, consume, and so forth over a very long time. In the process by which structuring decisions are made, different people are differently situated and possess unequal degrees of power as well as unequal levels of awareness. Choices become strongly fixed in the material equipment, economic investment, and social habit. Once the initial commitments are made, in that sense, technological innovations are similar to legislative acts that establish a framework for public order that will endure over many generations. The issues that divide or unite people in society are settled not only in the institutions and practice of politics proper, but also, and less obviously, in tangible arrangements of wires and transistors, nuts and bolts." So viewed through this lens of negotiation, these papers show what is implicated in technology use is not a simple question of digital divides, but rather ongoing contestation over such things as the categorization, classification, and identification of what labor is and how it is valued, what is a private and a public good, of who and what constitutes a social group, and what and where to locate and how to define social problems. So this is the things that I think really like bridge all of these wonderful papers together. Other themes that were very evocative in these papers that I noted, or that I just want to note and draw out. In these negotiation processes, all of the papers talk about the ways that multiple interests are intertwined, making, again, reiterating that point that technology is not neutral, and that even if there's an assumption of neutrality embedded in the rhetoric of actors in positions of power. Secondly, in these themes that the papers sort of drew out for me, all of the papers raise concerns about where agency is located, whether that's human or non-human, and what that means for pre-existing inequalities. And I do want to point out that you know, the papers really played with, okay, so are we taking on this like surveillance and victimization lens? No, they're really a much more complicated story in these papers, and I want to acknowledge that. All of the papers ask questions about, you know, are the failings of technological systems inadvertent consequences, things that people didn't plan for, or are they actually in reality not the point, right? And is there some other benefit, right, that might appear to be a situation of failure, but actually is providing things like organizational coherence and status for some of the organizations involved. And finally, all of the papers raise really important questions about regulation and protection and risk and surveillance and privacy and ultimately ethics. And they ask the question, what do these things mean for our society as a whole? So I have these 3 questions for the group. And you're gonna have to forgive me because they're terrible questions. They're difficult, and they're ones that I think about a lot with my own work, and I'm actually not sure how I would answer them. So just try to sort of play with the ideas. And I think the first one is the more theoretical one, and maybe the more potentially sort of challenging, I'm not sure, but so here we are all talking about technological change and inequality, and particularly the role of culture in that relationship. And often, although some would consider it a false dichotomy, culture is posed in contrast to structure, with the latter often being attached to institutions and institutionalization. So thinking about your paper and the topics that you study, how do you think about what is culture and what is structure and sort of their relationship? And I'm particularly interested in how you think about how the things you study relate to racialized, class, gendered, etc., organizational and institutional processes. That's number 1, easy. This is really just to get us like thinking a little, that one's more conceptual. Number 2 is, what do you view, and I get this question a lot again, so forgive me, I'm posing it to you to see how you think around the idea. What do you view as unique or new, if anything, about the digital context of what you study? Whether that's methodologically or substantively or both? Or do you think these processes are perhaps a new instantiation of long-established systemic inequities? And number 3, and this seems like a very obvious question for the particular moment, this crazy time that we're in right now. How does what you found or what you argue in your about your paper, does it change, if at all, in the context of the global pandemic and the widespread demands for racial justice? So those are the 3 big questions. I do want to keep an eye on time. Julia, should I just leave it at that? Because those are pretty thick questions. And then if the other ones come up, otherwise I'll send you guys my questions.
I think that's a great idea. Yes, Cassidy also prepared individual questions for all our panelists, but I think in the sake of time and the depth of those questions, I'll let y'all respond before moving on to those. So let's, if people are okay with it, we'll just go in the order of the presentations. And feel free to like take a stab at one, or if you have something to say about all of them, and keep your responses as brief as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, for time's sake, how long would you like us to or how short would you like us to keep our responses?
So I think what I've been told from ASA is that it's okay if we go over. There's nobody else coming into the room, but I know I'm missing bedtime right now, so my time is not limited, and I'm sure yours is also. So let's keep it to like a minute or 2. Each.
One other thing is, I think that right now, because I'm seeing the glowing thing around my face.
Oh, yes.
I think that we should make sure that everybody can be
seen. Let me eliminate that, yes.
Seeing visibility.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So shall I go first? Okay. Thank you, Cassidy, for these really, insightful observations, provocations. I'm going to quickly take up the question of culture and structure, knowing that it's not an easy question to answer in 2 minutes. But I think, at least in the context of my work, it became clear very quickly, but, coming from that sort of culture structure perspective, it was clear to me more quickly than my interlocutors that how people, or in what ways people believed in the potential of technology was already pretty classed and racialized to begin with. You know, the fact that if you are better connected, you have more opportunities in life is, you know, didn't really speak to my interlocutors in public housing areas, because they knew that there were already other barriers in their lives that they need to get over, that could not just be fixed by a super fast internet. And exactly because those beliefs and expectations and assumptions about technology were not part of the tech companies or local governments' plans to roll out these technologies in the first place, that this gap between the east side and the west side, the haves and have-nots and whatever, further widened. So I see a very sort of embedded connection between culture and structure that is not necessarily about, like, you know, cultures of groups, but in terms of the, you know, the stories we tell ourselves about technology, the expectations and beliefs and trust we bring into what we do and what we hope to do with those technologies, and the fears and mistrusts that are also a big part of how we interact with any kind of surveillance-based technologies, which may not seem like surveillance to some of us, but it very much does the same job, whether we, you know, acknowledge it or not. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for these great questions.
Okay, great. I'll jump in because it seems like we're doing round robin. Thank you so much, Cassidy, for these questions. They're fantastic. And I'm gonna pick and choose 1 and 3 because 2 is also my least favorite one to answer. So culture and structure. So I think it's super interesting in the context of my work. When I, in this case, thinking about culture as values, right? Like moral values. And in the design of these models, which are actually the structure of the model, and I think actually my face isn't lit up, so I might not be on the screen, but that's okay. Thanks, Julia.
I think you are.
Oh, I am. Okay, good. Okay, great. The thinking about culture and structure as in the case of these models being designed, the culture was actually informing the structure, right? It was the values that they wanted to create were dictating the type of structure they used, particularly in this idea of using blockchain technology and keeping things decentralized. I mean, that's so structural and technological, but it was a decision to create benevolence, and that's so cultural. So I think it's so interesting to see, and in the larger paper, I talk about kind of these other mechanisms that they're using to create the structure of the models that have to do with revenue streams and how funds get distributed within the system, which again are structural ideas, but they're being driven by these moral values. So I think it's really interesting as an argument for how they're not different, and one can inform the other, and probably in an iterative process, because the structure itself at some point is going to define the culture of how workers receive these benefits, you know, when all the models are implemented. So that's what I'd say for the first one. And for the third one, thinking about the current context, that's been particularly interesting for portable benefits, because non-standard workers, the Venn diagram of non-standard workers and essential workers they're like, you know, almost overlapping. So suddenly we're considering all these contingent workers essential on the one hand, and on the other hand, we're seeing the like large gaps in our safety net and in our protective benefit structure, especially around paid sick and safe time and health insurance, which again, non-standard workers don't have. So we're not only considering these workers essential, but we're also understanding, you know, how much we've been lacking. And I've seen like an unbelievable amount of movement forward in this space that I've been watching for 2 years. And in the last 3 months, you know, Seattle past paid sick time for their delivery drivers and their Uber and Lyft drivers, their rideshare drivers. Non-standard 1099s were included in unemployment benefits across the country. And like before this, it was like, oh, we don't know how to define them. We don't know how to, you know, we don't know how to categorize their work. And suddenly we figure out a way to do it, even if it was clunky, and they're receiving benefits. So that's going to actually be another chapter of my dissertation, kind of like what happens when this almost this like horrible natural experiment happened, and how does it shake up this whole field and suddenly create waves of change around these issues that like had felt stuck and were around classification and boundary making, and now we've resolved them, you know, kind of in the face of it. So I think it's a particularly interesting question for portable benefits, because it's about non-standard work and it's about these types of workers. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Lexi. Leslie, you're up.
Sure. So I am going to, I think, take up question 3, and I'm going to put a little timer on myself because I tend to lose track of time. So how does your argument change in the context of the current sort of pandemic and movement? I feel like everything about the way that my work, the way that I understand the significance of my work has changed due to this. Because when I started my work, it is true that the Black Lives Matter movement was sort of emergent, and it was definitely coming into play as a powerful social influence. But I also think that more is required. It's necessary but not sufficient condition for there to be like a critical mass of people mobilizing. And sort of sadly, I think a pandemic is kind of one of those big earth shifting things. And then of course the accompanying depression again hitting the same generation again. These are all sort of historical contexts that make it so that I think that the issue of disinformation and media is, sociologists should be thinking about how do we influence these few corporations and these few politicians that have this strong, powerful hold over you know, our public sphere, basically, that they're exercising through social media platforms.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you, Leslie. Dan, do you want to? Oh, you might still be muted.
Hi. Okay. So thanks, Cassidy, for those questions. I'll start with the first one. I think what's fascinating to me in studying this phenomenon is exactly the constant movement between, you know, the objective moment and the subjective one, and these tensions between culture and structure. And I think that I could have framed my argument as one that describes how different companies try to take their culture and turn it into structure, or like formalize it, or institutionalize it. And I'm really fascinated by these specific tensions and these processes. About the third question, how does it change my research? I'll answer from my interviewee's perspective. I studied companies in Israel, and now I study tech companies here in Silicon Valley. And I have to say that they don't seem too worried right now. I mean, as you can see, the stock market is booming. And I actually asked that question a few of my interviewees, and they say that we spend more time online now, so they have more data to work on, and it's also apparently easier to sign deals over Zoom and not flying abroad and meeting VCs and such. So for now, and of course, it's only from the business perspective, not the personal one. I mean, we're all horrified by what's happening, but it seems like the move to Zoomified existence is positive from their perspective, I think.
Great. And Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Cassidy, for the questions. think I'll take the second one about have things changed or is this unique? And as I was thinking about my response, I was wondering if it's shaped more by my disciplinary background than true differences. So when I think about kind of the work landscape and surveillance within work, you know, that goes back to the Pinkertons at least. And if we think about invisible work, that goes way back as well. And so when I think from those perspectives, I'm definitely thinking there's no change happening, or this is really just kind of a formulation of some longstanding patterns that are manifesting in new ways, to be sure. When I do think about what has changed, it does feel a little bit like perhaps the media landscape has changed a little bit, in which more things can be visible, and visibility maybe means something more or means something different. And so those are the kinds of questions I was starting to look at when I've been trying to think about this idea of contested vision, and we have these kind of competing ideas of what's out there and visible for people. And to me, that feels new, although it could just be that I'm new to that area of thinking about the world.
Great. All right. Well, I don't want to take up any more of our time, but I know I have follow-ups for each of you individually and perhaps collectively too. So I want to encourage anyone who is watching right now, thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you guys for sharing your work. Thank you for doing this work. It's so incredibly necessary. I feel like it's so trite now to say this, but like now more than ever, right? That we need to be critically interrogating these technologies and the assumptions that lay behind them, the way that our cultural ideas are shaping our new normals in a lot of ways, and for the foreseeable future. So thank you first to our panelists. Thank you to those who are watching, if anybody is watching on after the fact. And I encourage you all to reach out to someone you have a question to, try and get in touch with us. If you need help with that, you can always get in touch with me. I am being seen, as Sarah would say. I'm very being seen on the internets, so you can find me in those places. And yes, thank you all very much for spending time with us, for interrupting your very busy and full lives to spend some time talking about these really important issues. I appreciate it very much. And so with that, I will close our session.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much,
thanks,
Julia.
Julia.
Thank you to everyone.
And
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cassidy.
Great panel.